Hello, everybody. We are the Writer's Block, and we are back after a very, very tiny, very short break. Today we're talking about something near and dear to my heart, which is action scenes, just kind of describing fighting and all that. Because, of course, the point of any magic system is to then have fighting scenes. Obviously, not always, but it is something that I truly enjoy. Um, my personal favorite that I think started me down the path of uh, thinking about describing action scenes and enjoying action scenes, ironically, actually does not have a lot of magic. It's R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt Do'Urden and Drizzt Do'Urden's various adventures and his battles with Entry, the assassin, and everything. So I love the way those fights were choreographed and described, and that definitely is something that I'm always thinking back to a degree when I'm writing action scenes to make them as captivating as I felt those were when I was reading them. Just to go around, we'll go ahead and just go clockwise around. Erica, what for you is something in action, fantasy, or any book that you enjoy or a series?
I'm reading a book right now, Lovely War by Julie Berry. It's set in World War I with a Greek mythology twist.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of really great, lovely, sparse detail where you can tell that the soldiers are kind of losing it towards the end. And there's a lot of what's going on? How close are they? And you feel pleasantly disoriented. And then all of a sudden you get it like, oh, he had to use a bayonet. Now I get it. So it really gets you in the gut, but in a good way.
Cool, cool. I realized I should have said that Drizzt Do'Urden fights with scimitars, and it's all these like sword action scenes. I really just assume people know it's all sword action scenes. There wasn't a lot of magic. There is some, but anyway. Mason, what about for you?
Um, Great question. I would say the vast majority of my action influences aren't actually books, but maybe more comic books and TV shows and movies. That being said, though, a book series that I really enjoyed the action during was probably the Mistborn trilogy, which I think I've already advocated in the past on our channel. But again, think it's good stuff. So particularly enjoyed, since we're kind of talking about reasons why, particularly enjoyed kind of the concrete images given during the course of battle, kind of very distinct, impactful moments laced together through description. I really enjoyed that a lot. So, yeah.
Cool. And of course, Cameron.
So the one that springs to mind for me actually is Joe Abercrombie's First Law series.
Oh,
Low fantasy, very gritty, and quite honestly, in terms of the books themselves, they're not my favorites because they're just a little grim. I mean, there's a reason they call him Lord Grimdark, but the action in those books is fantastic in that it is clearly written, very well telegraphed, and has some real stakes to it. He is one of these writers, much like George R. R. Martin, who isn't afraid to kill off characters and have very bad things happen. And so you get a real sense of tenseness and danger when the swords come out, because anybody can go down. And in fact, some of the people that you love do.
Yeah, yeah. I love how all of you just did a beautiful job of not only talking about examples, but also talking about sort of learnable moments from them, where again, I gave nothing. So just kudos to all three of you. Doing a great job, even though I'm the one moderating this. And just to recap, so people are really seeing this, Erica was talking about sort of the moods that was happening there, which I thought was really fascinating, or this idea of, being kind of disoriented in the moment and then maybe sort of sudden reveal or action and then starting getting greater understanding. And so different than I would normally be thinking about for action. Mason touched more on what I would generally think of was just like clear descriptions so I can tell how that action is taking place. And obviously Cameron was mentioning that as well, but then Cameron also brings up this idea of stakes, this idea of a feeling of danger, of realizing this character could die, or this character could get horribly named. Can happen in Abercrombie's works. And that does create some differences in the scene. So what I was planning to get into next is what a lot of you are sort of naturally doing, which was a bit more of a conversation of what are some of, it doesn't need to necessarily be a full checklist, but of course it could be, if you so desire it to be, what are some things that you are doing when you know an action scene is imminent, whether you're, plotting or pantsing, whether you, have set up that there's an action scene there, or you arrive at the action scene, you're like, oh, action now. What are you doing to make that work? And for this one, so we'll go reverse order this time. So Cameron, what do you do for yourself?
One of the things, I probably do this a little too much, honestly, but one of the things that I always try to include in my action scenes are reversals, because it's not very interesting to me when one party really easily overpowers the other, especially if you're talking about your heroes. You want your heroes to have to struggle for their wins, or else they're just not very interesting wins. And so I struggle always and really work hard to have a couple of back and forths, like, hey, the hero's on top, and now something terrible happens and they're about to get skewered, and then they miraculously pull it out, and bounce back and forth between those poles at least 2 or 3 times before I come to a resolution, so that it feels like you've actually been like, oh, something, rather than just, oh, the good guy's gonna win like he always does.
Mason, what about you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I have kind of a two-pronged answer. One of which I think my biggest focus when I'm writing action is what can I do to make this a little bit different from just the standard fare, right? Because I think we can all agree that in fantasy, in science fiction, in genre fiction in general, I'd say we're all pretty well adjusted to violence, right? We grow up witnessing it in our favorite TV shows, movies, and reading it in our favorite books as well. And there is kind of this like standard approach, I think, a little bit, and a standard mentality. And so I think that both of the things that I try to focus on are ways that I try to not do that, in the hopes of maybe bringing in something a little bit special. One of those things is I think I try to make the action reflect character, and likewise character reflect action, right? Everything your character says and does on some level is a testimony of who they are. And so I think that spills into action as well. JJ, the guy behind me in this image, I think is a good example of that in the current book that I'm writing, because he lives in this metal suit and can never leave it. Violence for him is very different than it might be for you or me, because he's so removed. And that removal we may think is a nice thing, but for him it makes all of violence this kind of bitter reminder of how separated he is from everything that he cares about. So I would say that is one thing, right? Is making action character centered. The other thing I think is, and I'll be a little bit more brief on this, but I think that we do, generally speaking, have certain ways that we think strategy, weapons, and tactics function. I think that we've been taught by what we watch and by what we read that like swords are used in a particular fashion, right? Shields are used in another particular fashion, staffs likewise, so on and so forth down the line. But I think that as you maybe dig into some of the history there, and watch demonstrations and kind of learn a little bit about like real life combat, you can learn a lot that maybe brings a new level to your action, and a level that is both feasible and enjoyable to the average reader. Certainly not going to say that I'm an expert in combat or anything like that, but I do really enjoy sometimes just watching, like historical reaction, like historical recreations of like medieval tactics with a great sword, or something like that. It's a fun time, I think. So anyway,
One of the most fun things I've watched recently was watching a historical sword expert responding to the fights in the Witcher TV series.
yeah.
And just watching him foam at the mouth. We're like, you can't hold his sword like that. That's
Yeah, I love the Butcher of Blaviken scene in The Witcher, but yeah, it's funny to watch like historical recreationists like react to it and like hear their criticism, right? And maybe think to myself, is that something that I care about a ton, and am I going to act accordingly, or do I think that the Butcher of Blaviken is cool enough that I'm just going to do it anyways, you know?
Totally. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I've got queued up like just sword practice. Practice like sword scene forms. Please, Erica, what about you?
Going off Mason's earlier comment about character, the best action scene fighting advice I ever heard was from Dan Wells, who co-produces a podcast with Brandon Sanderson, where he said, in an action scene or any violent scene, you have to show what's happening both to the perpetrator and the victim. And I think like it's missed a lot. A lot of action scenes are very one-sided. And I think that's important on both the physical sense of, oh, I punched him and my hand hurts, and also the emotional ramifications of what's it doing, the exhilaration or the terror of where you are in the fight right now.
Really cool. Speaking of action, the fire alarm has just gone off. I was going to say, I think that actually sums up what we were, talking about here for this. So we're going to be all good now. Apparently, I'm not going to die in a fire. So jumping in into actually one last thing I did want to say before we wrap up our session day is I hope getting to hear from each person, has given you some thoughts about what you can do for your action scenes. For me, and I didn't quite hear this one yet, I'm sure it's ones people think about as well. In addition to some of the stuff that's been said, I do spend a fair bit of time sort of blocking it out, especially if it's a big fight. I've got some arena fight stories. I've got some like the big sort of trials, like tournaments and stuff like that. Tournaments are a little easier because you can often get away with one-on-one. But if you got bigger like team tournaments against each other, you got a lot of moving pieces that you got to think about where everybody is and not overwhelming the reader with information about every single person constantly, but making sure that people show up where they should be, where there's not too much of a time lag of someone just being randomly gone, but they would actually be jumping into the fight. So I would say, really thinking about blocking it out, whether you're writing it out or thinking through it, when you've got those larger action scenes, realize they can take a while to write, to really figure out how all those moving parts are going to interact with each other. And then for me, I do try to make sure that it is earned the win. And this was, again, sort of talked about, but like Kim was saying, we don't want it to be too easy. But also I want it to feel like something that the person could feasibly do. So, I don't want some person who's never held a sword before to come in and just body somebody that's been training their entire life. Like to me, I can't stand that. That's what makes me foam at the mouth, is where like somebody new that just, someone new that just started is suddenly amazing and the best ever. And sure, there can be some exceptions of that happen in real life. That's not the way it normally goes down. And I'm not saying you need to bore the reader with, a million training scenes, even though I would love that. But I will say that showing some proof as to how they got there, meaning if they are defeating somebody, that's something that we saw them do in some other aspect of their life that allowed them to do that. Or it is something they did have a training for to get there. So having sort of satisfying end reversals, like an end reversal of not just winning, but it feels earned that the person won it. So, my two would be, if you got, a bigger action scene, really take some time, think about your blocking, realize that scene might take a while, realize maybe you can jump past that scene and then come back to it because it may take a bit. And then the other thing would be make sure those fight results feel earned and not just, potentially cheap to the reader.
Can I throw in one other one?
Yeah. Any
before we
last things,
finish
feel
up?
free. There's no fire. We got all the time.
Sort of building off this idea of earning your wins, taking another step back from your story and sort of looking at it as a narrative that progresses. You want to make sure your action scenes are going to serve as spectacle, as set pieces throughout your story. And you want to make sure that you don't blow all your fireworks halfway through the story. So you want to pace yourself so that your action is interesting and consistently escalating. So you don't get the most interesting fight 1/3 of the way through the book, and then everything after that is a bit of a letdown. You want a sense of progression, of increasing difficulty, whether it's physical fights or magical fights or some other kind of action. You want to ramp up the spectacle until you reach the climax of your story, so that the climax of the emotion hits at the same time as the climax of your spectacle, because that's what really gets the juice flowing for the reader.
One thing, just going off Cameron's really quick, something I found works well if I'm plotting multiple fight scenes out over the course of a novel is a victory sandwich. So you have the first fight where you show your character's competent and they can beat this easy opponent. The second one where it's, oh crap, I do not know what I'm up against anymore. I'm out of my league here. And then because you've seen that failure, by using their competency to lay the groundwork, the success is more meaningful and it feels deserved once you finally get that at the climax.
Yeah, and I think leaving the reader not knowing, right? Because we don't want to read fights that we always know the outcome to. And so by having some losses threaded in there, it keeps the reader more on their toes, wondering what's going to happen. You don't have to kill off characters or maim them horribly to create a sense of wonder or danger. That's just one way, right? Well, thanks everyone. Really, of course, for all the great thoughts everyone here has given. We hope this is giving you all some ideas of how you might, approach writing action scenes, whether they have swords, magic, guns, whatever, in a slightly different way. And so you can find that, sweet spot for yourself. And of course, we're all growing, we're all changing over time. And so it's a process, but it's one that can be really enjoyable. All right, everyone, we'll catch you next time. See you later, Blackheads.